Converting Dwarf Fortress into a board game would be a complex task, given the depth and complexity of the original game. However, here are some general steps that could be taken to adapt it to a board game format. 1. Determine the core mechanics of the board game, such as how players will take turns, what actions they can take, and how the game will progress over time. 2. Create a game board that represents the world of Dwarf Fortress, including the different biomes, civilizations, and resources that players can interact with. 3. Develop game pieces and components that represent the various characters, creatures, and structures that players can encounter in the game. 4. Create a rulebook that explains how to play the game, including the different actions that players can take and how to resolve conflicts and challenges. 5. Playtest the game with a group of players to get feedback on the mechanics and balance of the game, and make any necessary adjustments before releasing the final version. In a board game adaptation of Dwarf Fortress, the core mechanics could include the following actions that dwarf characters can take on each turn. 1. Mine resources. Players can choose to mine for valuable resources like ore, gems, and precious metals, which can be used to build structures and craft items. 2. Build structures. Players can use their resources to construct buildings, workshops, and other structures that provide benefits to their settlement. 3. Craft items. Players can use resources and workshop buildings to craft weapons, armor, and other useful items for their dwarf characters. 4. Explore the world. Players can send their dwarves out to explore the surrounding environment, discovering new resources, encountering dangerous creatures, and engaging in diplomacy with other civilizations. 5. Defend the settlement. Players must also be prepared to defend their settlement from external threats like goblin invasions, giant monsters, and natural disasters. These core mechanics would provide players with a range of strategic options to consider each turn as they work to build and defend their dwarf settlement. In a board game adaptation of Dwarf Fortress, dwarves could mine and collect the following types of resources. 1. Ores. These include valuable metals like iron, copper, silver, and gold, which can be smelted into bars and used for crafting weapons, armor, and other items. 2. Gems. Dwarves can also mine for precious gems like diamonds, rubies, and sapphires, which can be used as valuable trade goods or for decoration. 3. Stone. Different types of stone like granite, marble, and obsidian can be mined and used for construction and crafting purposes. 4. Wood. Dwarves can chop down trees and collect wood for use in building structures and crafting items. 5. Plants. Various types of plants and herbs can be gathered from the environment and used for food, medicine, and other purposes. 6. Animals. Dwarves can also capture and domesticate wild animals, which can provide food, resources, and other benefits. Each of these resources would have different values and uses in the game, and players would need to carefully manage their resources to build and maintain a successful settlement. In a board game adaptation of Dwarf Fortress, dwarves could build a variety of structures, each with its own unique purpose and benefits. Some examples of possible buildings include 1. Farms. These structures would allow dwarves to grow food and raise animals for consumption. 2. Workshops. Different types of workshops could be built for crafting weapons, armor, furniture, and other useful items. 3. Barracks. Barracks would provide housing for dwarf soldiers and allow players to recruit and train a military force. 4. Towers. Towers could be built for defensive purposes, providing a vantage point for spotting approaching threats and firing arrows at enemies. 5. Temples. Temples would provide a place for dwarves to worship and pray, providing spiritual benefits and boosting morale. 6. Taverns. Taverns would provide a place for dwarves to socialize, drink, and relax, improving their happiness and reducing stress. Each building would require different resources to construct and would provide different benefits to the settlement, requiring players to carefully consider which buildings to prioritize based on their current needs and resources. Yes, in many ways, the board game adaptation of Dwarf Fortress that we're developing could be considered a worker placement game. In worker placement games, players must strategically assign their worker pieces to different locations or actions on the game board in order to gather resources, build structures, and achieve their objectives. In our Dwarf Fortress board game, each dwarf character could be considered a worker that can be assigned to different tasks and activities each turn. Players would need to decide where to send their dwarves to mine resources, build structures, craft items, and defend their settlement from threats. Some other popular worker placement games include Agricola, Lords of Waterdeep, and Caelus. While our Dwarf Fortress game would have its own unique mechanics and flavor, it would share some similarities with these other games in terms of worker placement and resource management. Exactly. In each turn of the Dwarf Fortress board game, players would have a certain number of dwarf characters to assign to different actions and locations on the game board. For example, a player might choose to send 2 dwarves to a mine to gather ore and gems, 1 dwarf to a carpentry workshop to craft wooden furniture, and 1 dwarf to a farm to plant crops. Each dwarf would have a limited number of actions they can perform each turn, requiring players to prioritize and strategize to make the most efficient use of their resources. Some locations on the game board, like workshops and farms, might only be able to accommodate a certain number of dwarves at a time, requiring players to plan ahead and consider the potential actions of their opponents. This would add a layer of competition and interaction to the game, as players race to gather resources and build structures before their opponents. That's a great idea, Uncle. Randomizing the biome by drawing terrain tiles at the start of the game would add a lot of replay value and variety to each game session. By limiting the number of tiles drawn, you could create different levels of difficulty, requiring players to adapt their strategies to the specific resources and challenges of each biome. For example, a desert biome might have fewer water and plant resources, making farming more difficult, while a mountain biome might have more ore and stone resources, but also more dangerous creatures like dragons and trolls. You could even include special event cards or tiles that trigger unexpected challenges or rewards during the game, adding even more unpredictability and excitement to each session. This would make each game feel unique and unpredictable, challenging players to think on their feet and adapt to changing circumstances. To incorporate the unique personalities and dynamics of the dwarves from Dwarf Fortress into the board game, we could use a combination of character cards and event cards. Each dwarf character could have a unique set of personality traits like stubborn, greedy, brave, or hardworking, which would influence their abilities and interactions with other dwarves and the environment. For example, a stubborn dwarf might be more resistant to negative effects but less open to new ideas, while a greedy dwarf might be more efficient at gathering resources but less willing to share with others. Event cards could then be drawn each turn, triggering random events that affect the game in different ways. Some events might be positive, like discovering a vein of rare ore or receiving aid from a friendly neighbor. Other events might be negative, like a goblin invasion or a natural disaster. Each event card could also include special rules or effects that interact with the dwarves' personalities, adding a layer of complexity and interaction to the game. To incorporate happiness and stress mechanics from Dwarf Fortress into the board game, we could use a dual track system for each dwarf character. Each dwarf would have a happiness and stress level, represented by two separate tracks or meters on their character card. Certain actions and events would increase or decrease the dwarves' happiness and stress levels, with different effects on gameplay. For example, completing a successful project or discovering valuable resources would increase happiness and decrease stress. Being attacked by enemies or experiencing a natural disaster would decrease happiness and increase stress. Some personality traits might affect how much happiness and stress are gained or lost from certain events. If a dwarf's happiness level becomes too low or their stress level becomes too high, they might suffer negative effects like decreased efficiency, increased vulnerability to negative events, or even becoming unplayable for a turn. This would add a new layer of complexity to the game, as players must not only manage their resources and defend their settlement, but also keep their dwarves happy and stress-free. Thanks. I think it would be a lot of fun to play too. Here are a few more ideas to add even more depth and variety to the game. 1. Faction interactions. Add multiple factions or civilizations to the game, each with their own unique traits and agendas. Players could interact with these factions through diplomacy, trade, or combat, adding more strategic options and replay value. 2. Specialized dwarves. Introduce different types of dwarves with unique abilities and roles such as engineers, miners, soldiers, or diplomats. Players could assign these specialized dwarves to tasks that play to their strengths, making their actions more efficient and effective. 3. Dynamic world events. Include global events or crises that affect all players and require collective action to overcome, such as a spreading plague or a harsh winter. This would encourage players to cooperate and make strategic decisions as a group, rather than just focusing on their own settlement. Here's one more addition that could make the game even more engaging and strategic. 4. Resource scarcity and depletion. Introduce a mechanic where resources become more scarce or even deplete over time, requiring players to adapt their strategies and priorities as the game progresses. For example, overmining a certain resource might cause it to become depleted, forcing players to find alternative sources or switch to different materials. This would add an extra layer of realism and challenge to the game, as players must manage their resources carefully and plan for long-term sustainability rather than just maximizing short-term gains. It would also encourage players to explore and interact with different parts of the game board, adding more variety and replay value to each game session. Thank you, Uncle. I really appreciate your kind words. It was a fun exercise to come up with these game mechanics, and I think it shows how much potential Dwarf Fortress has as a board game adaptation. It's always fascinating to see how video games can be translated into tabletop games, and vice versa. Both mediums offer their own unique advantages and challenges, and it's exciting to explore the creative possibilities of each.